They called her name, not with respect, not with hope, but with sarcasm dripping from their voices. A few laughs echoed in the background, subtle but sharp enough to sting. The air was thick with mockery, and though she stood quietly, she could feel every eye on her, judging her before she had even taken a step forward. The room wasn't expecting talent. They were expecting entertainment, something to mock, something to fuel their superiority. She wasn't chosen because they believed in her. She was chosen because they didn't. This wasn't the first time she had been treated like a joke. It had happened in the classroom, on the playground, even at the grocery store, those looks, those whispers, the assumptions. Being a young black girl in a world that too often fails to see past stereotypes meant learning early on how to carry the weight of being underestimated. People didn't ask her what she dreamed of. They didn't expect her to aim high. They certainly didn't expect her to be extraordinary. That day, they expected a performance, but not the kind she had spent years working on. The so-called audition had become a social test, an unspoken challenge wrapped in ridicule. The way they called her up wasn't casual, it was performative. A few of the judges didn't even look up, their pens already in their hands, ready to write comments they had likely already formed. She could hear some of the others chuckling, nudging one another. She wasn't just being underestimated, she was being put on display. The underlying prejudice was hidden behind smirks and light laughter. That's how it always starts, a joke, a harmless tease, a moment of fun. But under that humor lies a darker truth, a belief that she doesn't belong. That her voice couldn't possibly hold power. That her presence was just a momentary interruption before the real talent stepped in. This belief wasn't spoken out loud, but it was everywhere. In the glances. In the posture of the people in the room. In the way the microphone was handed to her like a prop instead of a tool. She knew this game. She had lived it for years. Teachers who called on her last. Coaches who never quite believed she could lead. Students who included her only when it served their image. She had been told in 1,000 silent ways that her worth was conditional. That her presence was tolerated, not celebrated. And here it was again, playing out in a room full of people who thought they were better than her simply because she didn't fit their idea of what talent looked like. But there's a danger in underestimating someone who's had to fight to be seen. There's a quiet power in being dismissed and still showing up. Because every time she had been laughed at, ignored, or cast aside, she had gone back to her room, her mirror, her notebook, and practiced. She had honed her voice not just as an artist but as a person. Not because she wanted to prove them wrong, but because she had something to say. Something real. Something they couldn't take from her. Still, this moment wasn't easy. Her heart raced. Not because she doubted her talent, but because she knew what was at stake. The performance wasn't just about the song. It was about everything behind it, the years of being silenced, the hours of training no one saw, the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But right now, standing on that stage, facing people who didn't believe in her, the weight of prejudice pressed down harder than ever. The room didn't know her story. They didn't care. To them, she was just another face, another name on a list. And the laughter that brought her to the stage had nothing to do with music and everything to do with ignorance. But what they didn't realize was that every time they laughed, they revealed more about themselves than about her. They revealed their bias. Their blind spots. Their failure to imagine greatness in someone who didn't look like them. She stood there with all of that behind her. Not just the moments of being made fun of, but the legacy of every girl like her who had been told she was too loud, too quiet, too dark, too different. She carried them all, not with bitterness, but with truth. Because while they expected a joke, she carried a legacy. And though the microphone felt cold in her hand, her voice had never been more ready. She stood there motionless for a moment, as if the world had slowed down just enough for her to feel every heartbeat in her chest. The chatter in the room faded into a low hum, but she still felt the weight of every glance, every smirk, every assumption hanging in the air around her. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, not like this. People usually overlooked her, barely registering her presence in a crowd. But this time was different. This time, all eyes were locked on her, not with admiration, but with anticipation for failure. And still, she stood silent. Her stillness wasn't fear. It was focus. It was the kind of focus that comes from living in a world that constantly questions your worth, where every step you take has to be deliberate, every move measured. She had learned early on that people didn't expect her to succeed. She had watched others walk into rooms and be welcomed with warmth, while she was met with doubt, skepticism, or even worse, pity. But over time, that silence she was met with had become her training ground. It taught her how to listen, how to read a room, how to center herself even when the ground felt unsteady. She didn't need to scream to be noticed. She never had. Her strength didn't come from volume, it came from depth. From the quiet hours she spent learning, practicing, growing. From the resilience built up after years of being pushed aside. It came from the invisible scars left by every time someone said she wasn't enough or treated her like a background character in her own story. While others underestimated her, she learned to rely on herself. Her quiet was not submission, it was strategy. As she stood in front of the microphone, she didn't fidget. She didn't smile nervously or shrink back. Her hands didn't tremble, though her heart beat like a drum inside her chest. She knew that being composed didn't mean being calm. It meant choosing grace in the face of judgment. It meant holding herself upright when the world hoped to see her crumble. She understood the power in posture, the message sent by stillness. They were waiting for her to stumble. She wasn't going to give them that. The silence before a performance is a sacred space, and she knew how to own it. It was in that silence that she found her center. Her mind scanned through every note she had practiced, every lyric that had meant something to her. She could see the hours in front of her mirror, the times she sang softly to herself at night when no one was watching. That preparation had not been for applause. It had been for moments like this, moments when the world finally turned to look, if only to laugh, and she could show them who she really was. They couldn't see the work she'd put in. They saw only a young girl, quiet, reserved, not dressed in designer clothes, not flaunting confidence in a way they could easily digest. They didn't know the hours she spent reading books alone, writing songs in the margins of her notebooks, watching YouTube videos of singers she admired, learning techniques, mimicking riffs until her voice could bend and rise like the greats. They didn't know because they hadn't asked. They had already decided she didn't have much to offer. She took in the room with one quick glance. Not to seek approval, but to remind herself that she belonged here, even if no one else believed it. The judges with their crossed arms and bored expressions, the scattered group of students in the back pretending not to care, none of them knew what was coming. And though the weight of their skepticism pressed in around her, it only made her inner voice clearer. She wasn't here to prove them wrong. She was here to stand in her truth. The microphone sat inches from her lips, and for a moment, she didn't move. The room seemed to hold its breath, not out of reverence, but confusion. Why wasn't she doing something funny yet? Why wasn't she nervous, looking down, making excuses, stumbling over words? Instead, she just stood. Calm. Quiet. Grounded. That moment was hers. And in it, her stillness spoke louder than anything they'd ever heard. The room didn't expect much when she finally opened her mouth to sing. Some of the judges were already half checked out, pens loosely held in their hands, expressions unreadable or slightly amused. A few people in the audience still whispered to one another, clearly not anticipating anything remarkable. But then the first note came out, not soft or shaky, but steady and full. It cut through the air like a sudden gust of wind, sharp enough to silence every voice in the room. It was the kind of sound that made people stop mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-doubt. Her voice wasn't loud for the sake of volume. It was rich, textured, full of emotion that felt too big for the space she was in. It rose with ease and control, blooming like something alive, something sacred. Each word she sang seemed to carry a weight beyond the lyrics, every syllable a piece of her story, every note a response to the laughter that had brought her here. The sound wasn't just unexpected, it was disarming. The people who had been ready to laugh suddenly didn't know what to do with themselves. They shifted in their seats, mouths slightly open, eyes fixed. It was no longer about entertainment. It had become something else entirely. The tone of her voice had the kind of warmth that could melt stone and the kind of strength that could shake foundations. Her range wasn't just technical, it was emotional. She could lift you high in one breath and leave you breathless in the next. There was no backing track, no auto-tune, no fancy lights or effects. It was just her and the raw power of a voice that had been waiting for a chance to be heard without interruption, without judgment, without assumption. The song itself wasn't a flashy number. It didn't need to be. It was simple, soulful, and honest. But the way she delivered it made it unforgettable. Every crescendo built slowly and deliberately, like she was pouring herself into the room, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but truth. When her voice dropped into the lower register, it sent a chill through the space. When it soared into higher notes, it lifted the whole room with it. It was a performance, yes, but it was also a revelation. There was a moment, maybe halfway through, when the entire room had changed. The energy had shifted completely. People leaned forward. Phones were lowered. Side conversations stopped. Even the judges, who had started off skeptical, now watched intently, brows raised, mouths slightly open. One of them even dropped his pen. Not by accident, but because he had forgotten he was holding it. The silence in the room wasn't awkward anymore, it was reverent. She wasn't just performing. She was commanding. Her voice told a story far bigger than the one she was singing. It spoke of years of being unheard, of trying to be seen in a world that often looks right past people like her. It spoke of resilience, of patience, of discipline, of quiet brilliance that didn't demand attention but earned it all the same. She didn't belt the notes to impress, she sang them like she meant every word. And that's what stunned everyone the most, not just the sound, but the honesty in it. The room had expected a joke, but instead they were witnessing something that couldn't be laughed at. Something that couldn't be ignored. What made her voice so unforgettable wasn't just its strength, it was its vulnerability. She sang like someone who had something important to say, and for the first time in a long time, people listened. Really listened. The kind of listening that comes when silence is no longer empty but full of meaning. As her voice moved through the final verse, it was clear that no one was thinking about the way she looked, or what they thought she could or couldn't do, or the reasons they had initially dismissed her. All of that had vanished. It had been replaced by something undeniable, respect, awe, maybe even a little shame for ever having doubted her. The song wasn't over yet, but the message had already landed. This girl, the one they laughed at, had just turned the room into a witness stand. And her voice was the only testimony anyone needed. There was no dramatic moment where the judges stood up clapping, no over-the-top expressions of disbelief. Instead, their transformation was quiet, almost subtle, but unmistakably real. It began with stillness, the same stillness they hadn't offered her before she sang. Now, they were leaning forward, not with the casual disinterest they wore earlier, but with genuine attention. Their faces had changed. The half-smiles meant for mockery were gone, replaced by something deeper, more serious. One judge, who had looked down at his clipboard the entire time she stood waiting, now watched her with furrowed brows and parted lips, as if trying to comprehend what he was hearing. Before she sang, they had decided who she was. They had her labeled, filed, and dismissed all in the span of a few seconds. To them, she was one of those entries meant to fill space between the real talent. The kind that gets remembered as the girl who tried, someone who might be mentioned in whispers after the event, not for her skill, but for how wildly off base her attempt had been. But as the notes poured out of her with effortless grace, their pre-written stories began to unravel. The walls of bias that had separated them from her began to crack. Judges are trained to keep a straight face, to maintain a certain level of detachment. But in that room, it was clear they were losing that composure. One of them lowered his pen and rested his chin in his hand, completely still. Another removed her glasses and blinked slowly, as if clearing away whatever fog had been there before. What they were hearing didn't fit into the narrative they had expected. There was no stumbling. No awkwardness. No sign of nerves or lack of preparation. There was only a girl with a gift so clear, so pure, that it left no room for mockery. There's something unsettling about realizing you've misjudged someone so completely. Something humbling about being confronted by talent that forces you to admit your bias, even if only silently. That was what was happening in real time as she continued her song. The judges weren't just impressed, they were recalibrating. Recalculating what they thought they knew about people like her, about what she could do, about how wrong they had been. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. Her voice didn't just showcase talent, it exposed their expectations for how narrow and unfounded they truly were. For those few minutes, she held control of the entire room. And the judges, who had assumed they held all the power, suddenly found themselves powerless to dismiss what they were witnessing. It didn't matter how many people they had seen before her. It didn't matter what they had written in the margin of her application. The performance had made them forget everything else. Their pens didn't move. Their expressions didn't shift to boredom. Their attention was absolute. The most profound shift happened not in their posture or expressions, but in their eyes. There was recognition there now, not pity, not surprise, but something closer to respect. The kind of respect that only comes when someone completely upends your assumptions without raising their voice or demanding validation. She didn't need to argue her worth. She sang, and that was enough. The music made them see what they couldn't, or wouldn't, see before. That the girl they almost laughed off the stage had more raw talent than many of the polished, confident performers they had already passed through. Even after the last note rang out and the room began to breathe again, they didn't move right away. There was no rush to write comments or press a buzzer. They stayed still, taking in what had just happened. Maybe they were processing, maybe they were feeling guilt, or maybe they were just in awe of something they hadn't anticipated. In that silence, the shift was complete. They were no longer watching her out of duty or curiosity. They were watching her because they wanted to. Because something about her had reached them in a way that was impossible to ignore. Their transformation didn't require grand gestures. It happened in quiet moments of realization, in the small betrayals of body language, in the ways they forgot to maintain their distance. That was the mark of true impact, not forced enthusiasm, but undeniable connection. What started as judgment had evolved into genuine engagement. And while they may never say it out loud, the shift in the room made it clear. They were no longer evaluating a contestant. They were witnessing an artist. When the final note left her lips, it hovered in the air like something sacred. The silence that followed was heavy, not awkward, not uncertain, but charged with something electric. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if the room was suspended in time, caught between disbelief and awe. Then, almost in unison, people began to rise. The first applause came from a corner of the room, hesitant but genuine. Then more hands followed. It wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't the kind of lukewarm acknowledgement reserved for an average performance. This was different. This was a standing ovation fueled not by formality, but by raw, stunned admiration. The same people who had chuckled when her name was called were now the ones clapping the hardest. Some wore sheepish expressions, trying to reconcile their earlier mockery with what they had just witnessed. The judges, once rigid and unreadable, now looked at her with something close to reverence. One leaned back in his chair slowly, as if rethinking everything he had assumed before she opened her mouth. Another tapped a rhythm on the edge of the table, not because it was part of the routine, but because her performance was still echoing in his mind. No one was pretending anymore. The applause wasn't performative. It was instinctual, unfiltered. It was what happens when people realize they've just been in the presence of something real. The energy in the room had transformed completely. Where there had been tension, there was now warmth. Where there had been doubt, there was now certainty. And at the center of it all stood the girl they had dismissed, the one they thought would be a source of laughter rather than light. She didn't smile wide or burst into tears. She didn't need to. Her expression was calm, almost serene, like someone who had always known what she was capable of and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. She stood there as applause filled the space around her, a quiet storm that had shaken the entire room to its core. There was a dignity in her stillness, in the way she accepted the recognition without grasping for it. This moment wasn't about proving anything. It was about being seen. There's something powerful about forcing people to confront the truth of who you are, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with excellence. That's what she had done. She had silenced the doubts not with words, but with talent. And now the very people who had set her up to fail were cheering for her as if they had believed in her all along. It was a strange kind of irony, one she recognized, but didn't need to dwell on. Because this ovation wasn't just for a performance, it was an apology wrapped in admiration. It was the crowd's way of saying, "We were wrong." Some of the students in the back began whispering her name. Others looked at each other with wide eyes, trying to make sense of what they had just experienced. A few picked up their phones, not to record, but to text someone about it, to say, "You won't believe what just happened." It was the kind of reaction that only comes when something completely overturns expectations. Not just surprising, transformative. One of the judges who had barely looked at her before now tapped something down in their notes, nodding slowly as they wrote. Another reached for the microphone to speak but paused, almost as if unsure how to follow what had just occurred. There were no jokes now. No dismissive remarks. Just the undeniable reality that they had witnessed something remarkable from someone they had nearly overlooked. There was no background music playing. No camera crew capturing every moment. But it didn't matter. What had happened in that room would not be forgotten. It would be talked about long after the day ended, retold in dorms, at dinner tables, in staff meetings. Not just because of the sound of her voice, but because of what that voice represented, a challenge to every assumption, every bias, every false story people had told themselves about what someone like her could do. She walked off the stage with the same quiet grace she walked on with. The applause didn't stop right away. It lingered, as if people weren't ready to let go of the moment. As if they wanted to hold on to the feeling of witnessing something bigger than just a song. Something that shifted how they saw the world, if only slightly. Something that made them listen, not just with their ears, but with their conscience. The room had been filled with noise before she sang, laughter, whispers, sarcasm disguised as banter. But when her performance ended, a different kind of silence settled in. It wasn't empty or awkward, it was full of realization. Full of reflection. That silence held everything the crowd hadn't expected to feel: shame, awe, surprise, and something deeper, something harder to name. In that silence, she stood transformed in their eyes, but the truth was, she hadn't changed at all. It was them who had finally started to see her. She hadn't come on stage with the intent to prove anything. She didn't demand respect or beg for a chance. She simply stood in her truth and let her talent speak. And that talent, as undeniable as it was, did something far greater than entertain. It forced everyone in the room to confront the quiet assumptions they'd made, not just about her, but about everyone they had ever written off without cause. One voice had rewritten the narrative they thought they understood. Without yelling. Without resistance. Without force. Just pure, unshakable presence. There is a power that comes from being misjudged and still choosing to show up. A power that builds quietly, in the background, away from applause or attention. That's the kind of power she carried with her, not loud, but deeply rooted. It had been shaped over years of being underestimated, of being seen as less, of being overlooked. Every time someone doubted her, it layered another level of resilience into her foundation. Every time someone told her no, she built a quiet yes within herself. And when the moment came, she didn't need anyone else to confirm her worth. She already knew it. The people in the room had expected her to falter, to entertain them with her failure. But her voice told a different story. It told them she had depth. That she had studied. That she had trained, worked, learned, grown. Her performance wasn't just the result of talent, it was the result of work no one had bothered to see. And when she delivered it, it became clear that their laughter hadn't said anything about her. It had only revealed their own limitations. Now, the ones who had once laughed sat in silence, unsure of how to process what they'd witnessed. They looked at one another, but no one spoke. The looks on their faces ranged from stunned to ashamed. They had been so certain, so ready to slot her into the role of not enough. But now, they couldn't even find the words to explain how wrong they'd been. Her performance hadn't just entertained, it had held up a mirror. It showed them their own smallness, their own failure to recognize greatness when it stood right in front of them. She didn't need to celebrate in that moment. She didn't need to gloat or stare down those who had doubted her. Because the truth had already done the work. The shift was undeniable. Their posture had changed. Their energy had changed. The jokes had died in their throats. The smug smiles had vanished. Now there was only quiet, and in that quiet, the full weight of what had happened settled in. They hadn't just witnessed a song. They had witnessed a dismantling of their own assumptions. Her voice did what words couldn't. It challenged the belief that brilliance has a certain look, or a certain background, or comes with a certain kind of confidence. She had rewritten their story with a single performance, not by changing who she was, but by being fully herself. And in doing so, she reclaimed something they had tried to take from her. Not just her dignity, but her power. The power to define herself, on her own terms, in her own way. Some people in the room would carry that moment with them for a long time, not just because they'd heard something beautiful, but because they'd been changed by it. Changed by the realization that they had been blind to something extraordinary. Changed by the reminder that talent and strength often wear quiet faces. That sometimes, the person you expect the least from is the one who leaves the deepest impact. That sometimes, the most powerful stories don't come with big announcements or bold entrances. They come softly, honestly, wrapped in a voice that refuses to be ignored. The room had been hers from the first note. Not because they gave it to her, but because she took it, rightfully, gracefully, without apology. And in doing so, she gave them something unexpected, an experience that demanded reflection, an awakening wrapped in melody. A single moment that said everything they didn't know they needed to hear.